Oh, what a pleasure it is to be here. Like she said, my name's Jason Corley. I'm the Director of Operations for a group called New Generations. And I'm just grateful for you guys' support. And it's long overdue for me to come here and just say thank you. So thank you very much. But also a big thank you to Nicole and Sean. They've been a blessing to me personally for most of my life. And especially during those pivotal moments when you really need direction in prayer, to have people like Sean and Nicole to be able to pray with you and help speak into your journey has been an absolute blessing. So thank you. You guys are awesome. A little bit more about me. Like I said, my name is Jason Corley. I've been married to Sheila for 24 years. We have 2 great kids and another kid. All joking aside, for all of you, anybody in here who have family members who struggle with mental health issues, my heart goes out to you. I hope and pray that you find people who can gather around you and pray for you and encourage you as you battle against wars that are largely unseen. I think we're going to pop up a picture of my crew real quick. There's my crew. Wishing they were with us today. I'm also very proud of my heritage and my extended family. In this next picture, you'll see pictures of my grandparents. My grandparents, after the war, moved outside of Brownsville, built a home there, and had 6 kids. My mom and my father moved out of the state when I was like 5. But Oregon has been the one central thing in my life that has always remained consistent. All my other aunts and uncles are here. And so regularly I get opportunities to come back and visit, and it's always an honor and pleasure to be here. If you don't know this, the person on the right is me, and I have a cousin who's the same age as me. I don't know if you can recognize her, but her name's Nicole. Like I said, Nicole's been a blessing to me my entire life. But I'm really proud of my grandparents. They really modeled for their kids and their grandkids a lifestyle of service to their country, to their community as police officers, and to their church. And you can see that model as it ripple effects down through the generations, whether people are serving in the military, serving in police forces, or serving in churches. In fact, up until 5 years ago, 5 of their grandkids were working in churches. I was actually a part of a very large church in Arizona up until about 5 years ago. We're a church have an average weekend attendance about 10,000, and our global team was 8 people. That was our global staff. It was a real honor to be there. I was actually shocked that God would invite me into that role, but we were really focused on trying to reach North Africa, and so we were partnering with 62 different missionaries and ministries to try to reach that part of the world. But a lot of the efforts that we were engaged in weren't seeing a lot of fruit. They were really struggling. But there was one particular group that I kept getting reports back on that I kept hearing more and more incredible things of what they were doing. And eventually, I went on a trip to go see it. I was like, I got to see this for myself. So I went on a trip, and on the way back, I remember writing an email to a few of my friends, and I said, I think I just saw the future of missions. And completely unconnected, the president of that organization emailed me the next day and said, I'd like to have a conversation with you. And I said, I'd like to talk to you too. And that began a 9-month courtship, and on September 1st will be my 5th anniversary of joining a group that's now called New Generations. And you'll see from this map these different regions where we work in. We've just begun trying to engage more in North America, but most of our work for the last 16 years has been in these other regions. And as the Director of Operations, I largely support regional directors who are over each one of these colored regions. Most of them are what I would call sons of the soil, meaning they don't look like me. They're locals from there. God has gifted them and anointed them. And so I continue to ask my friend who lives in Egypt, have you found your local? Like, we're looking for that Billy Graham of Egypt, right? Like, we need to find those kind of people who have that kind of anointing in each one of these regions. Outsiders can't get the job done as well as a local can. And so my job is just to help them and support them. And but many of them are working in very difficult places. They see a lot of very difficult things. And I think they have a lot to say to us as we as a country are headed into a very difficult time. And so I think some of the lessons that I've learned as I've partnered with them, I'd like to share with you today. One of the bigger ideas that I want to touch on is going to be up in the next slide. And that's this idea that within every crisis is a kingdom opportunity. When you work in very difficult regions, you start seeing things very differently. And I really appreciate Sean and Casey, what you guys started touching on as we were going into this time together. It actually has a lot to do with what I'm going to be talking about. Yes, harm comes, but there is no irredeemable harm that will come to you. God can redeem just about anything. And if we look at it through a kingdom perspective, we'll see different things. And so we're going to look at some things and try to look at it from a kingdom perspective. Some of it is a little counterintuitive, and so we'll try to challenge your paradigm a little bit today. But I'd like to start by reading out of John. This is the famous story before Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. And I think Jesus believes that every crisis has a kingdom opportunity. And I think we're going to see some of that. John 11:1 says, "Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, 'Lord, the one you love is sick.' When he heard this, Jesus said, 'This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it.' Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus." Let me say that again. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So what did he do? So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Why? Why did he stay 2 more days? I think he knows something that we don't know. I think he is aware that within every crisis is a kingdom opportunity. In fact, you can almost read verse 4 differently and say, "This crisis will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." So let me pray. Dear Father, I thank you for who you are. I thank you for how you work through crisis, how you work through difficulty, how you work through harm and pain and suffering. Lord, I thank you for this church. I thank you for what you're doing through this church. I thank you for what you've already begun to speak this morning about how you take graves and turn them into gardens and turn seas into highways. Lord, you're the only one who can. And Lord, I think you have a lot more to say about that this morning, and so I pray that you'd help me to get out of the way and let you speak about what you're already doing around the world through difficult experiences. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so it was the mid-90s, and war was ravaging all over West Africa. Radical militia groups were going into villages and killing grandparents and children, babies and girls, mothers and fathers. But they were snatching up little boys and forcing them to murder others and turning them into boy soldiers. It was a horrible time. If you've ever seen the movie Blood Diamond, you have a really clear picture of what that time in history was like. It was awful. Simultaneously, on the other side of the world, there was a small church in Tennessee, and they were looking for a new pastor. And they approached a man named Jerry Trousdale and said, "Would you lead our church? Would you pastor our church?" And he said, "I will under 2 conditions. First, in addition to being the lead pastor, I want to be the missions pastor. And second, as a church, I want us to try to reach one of the most difficult people groups in the world." He said, "Okay, deal." So he joins them, and they start praying, "Lord, where do you want us to engage? Where would you like us to be at work?" And he started pointing them towards a people group, an Islamic radical people group within West Africa. And so they gathered a small group of their leadership team, including this one young man who was associate district attorney, and they traveled to West Africa, landed in the capital, and drove up to the second largest city and gathered together some local churches and started casting their vision for how they wanted to reach this other people group a little farther north. They said, "We want to go up north. Can you take us?" And people were like, "Oh, don't go up there. Like that road that leads up there, like thousands of people have died. People are dying all the time." They said, "Well, can we at least gather together and pray?" And so they started praying together. And Jerry says, as they were praying, he took notice of one young man. His name is Bertolo Johnson. or actually that's what he's asked me to call him for security. But at the time, he was a very young man. And as they were praying that night, they had a whole long night of prayer. And Jerry said it was one of those few times. You know, many of you have this gifting of hearing from God regularly. Not everybody experiences that. This was Jerry's, one of those few times where God made it very clear to him. Yes, you should go. But that young man, that district attorney or associate district attorney, he has young kids at home. He should go back to the Capitol. But he didn't say anything because, sometimes the first time you're hearing, you're like, oh, should I say something or not? And so he remains quiet. And after about an hour of praying, Bertolo Johnson stands up and with full conviction says, I believe we've all heard from God today. We should all go north, except for that young man. He should go back to the Capitol. I said, okay. So they all gathered together and they started driving north. And I wish I had time to tell you each person's perspective on how they are all convinced that an angel went with them and protected them through this difficult road. I would like to say other things, though, so I'm going to keep moving on. But when they got to this difficult people group, what they found were people starving to death. They went with fear, expecting to find violent people, and found people dying of starvation. They had eaten up all their food and had already started eating the seed that was intended for next year's harvest. And Jerry, being moved with compassion, goes home and starts raising up money from his church and from people around him, and they send money back to Bertolo and they start providing food. A while later, maybe a year later, Jerry has the opportunity to go back. He reconnects with Bertolo and they go north. And they have the opportunity, if you can go to the next couple slides, that's Bertolo and his wife, Santa. Go to the next one. This is a picture of them when they got up there. And the man in the middle is what they call a paramount chief. A paramount chief is like a chief of chiefs. And this particular paramount chief was living in the United States during the wars. And the previous paramount chief had died. And now he's back and he's reinstated. And he stands up in front of everybody and says, thank you to Jerry and Bertolo and everything you've done for our people. God knows what would have happened had you not provided the food and the resources and the seed for our next year's harvest. Thank you so much. From now on, you have our protection. You can do whatever you want in our community. You are welcome to be here. And he pulled Jerry aside, Jerry and Bertolo aside, and he said, hey guys, when I was back in the United States, I married a born-again Christian. And even though I'm a Muslim, she gave me a Bible and I read it every night. And I want you to know that you're more than welcome to send your church planters, your storytellers, your coaches, your trainers. Please send them. They're welcome to be here anytime. So they left with that blessing, with that covering, and they continued their work, but they were a little bit stifled. If you ask them, I know they're both on our team, and I've interviewed both of them as I was preparing to share their story, and they would say that they didn't have a clear direction on how they should go. Yes, they had the blessing, but they were like, okay, how do we reach a people group that spreads all across West Africa? And as they were praying through this, a completely separate story, as they were visiting a school, they met a little boy. His name is Idrissa. And I'd like to show you a picture of Idrissa. This is actually after Idrissa's had a couple surgeries. When they first met Idrissa, he didn't have a nose or an upper lip or a palate. And he was kind of hiding behind the back door of the school. And Bertolo invited him forward and started asking him what happened. And these militia groups came to his village, had killed his family. And as a toddler, he was screaming. And they took a butt of a gun and they bashed his face in, intending to kill him. And it didn't kill him. Bertolo and Santa eventually adopted Idrissa. And Jerry found hospitals in Tennessee that would start doing surgeries on him. They took some skin from his forehead and made a nose, and they started. But some of his surgeries couldn't be done until he was older. And so Idrissa is now 19. He's had 18 surgeries. But because of this, what happened to him, he's had the opportunity to move to the United States, and he's now in school in Chicago. But what they would consider one of the most divine appointments was when Bertolo brought him out for a surgery in Tennessee. Somebody said, hey, there's a man speaking at church. His name is David Watson. He's doing a perspectives course. Does anybody know what perspectives is? Anybody else heard of this? It's like a missions course. If you want to learn about missions, go to perspectives. And Dave Watson was speaking. And so they went to go hear this man speak. And Bertolo tells this story of listening to this man casting vision around this idea of movements. And at the time, not many people were talking about movements. And he was like, man, this guy, what he's talking about is happening in India. Either he's lying or he's crazy. Or I just heard what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. This is incredible. And with his help and Jerry's help, they've formulated a way of summarizing an approach towards ministry that I'd like to just run through really quickly here. And they would then use this in West Africa. So go ahead and throw up that next slide. All right, so for them, this is the best way to approach reaching a new area, to launch a disciple-making movement. That's what DMM stands for, disciple-making movement. First, form a prayer base. And they were like, yeah, we're used to that. We were praying in our church. Bertolo was praying with us there. And yeah, okay, we get it. Train local leaders. Yeah, it was about Bertolo. It wasn't about Jerry in Tennessee. It was about Bertolo and his team training local leaders. Find a reason to enter a community, a natural reason. In some places, it might be like, this is a picture of our regional director in East Africa providing food during a famine. There might be other ways to enter a community, like providing water or education or medical care. But find a reason to be there. But while you're there, look for persons of peace. This idea of person of peace comes out of Luke 10, Matthew 10. Or for me, I really like Acts 10, where they tell the story of Cornelius, who's not a believer yet, but he starts having this experience with God, and eventually Peter shows up and explains the way of the Lord to him more clearly. There are people that God is working in already, like that paramount chief. He was already reading the Bible before they got there, right? If you keep your eyes open for persons of peace, you'll find them. Now, keep in mind, these are not relief efforts. Lots of people do relief and never speak of Jesus. That's not what we're about. We're about finding reasons to naturally be in a community, and that may be providing relief, but we're looking for persons of peace. And when you find them, you form a Discovery Bible study, and I'll talk more about that later. And then that group of locals starts studying the Bible, usually creation to Christ, and then you coach them towards salvation, you coach them towards baptism, you coach them towards forming their first church, you coach them towards multiplying in their network, and then you coach them towards multiplying in new networks. Notice the last 5, it's coach, 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 coach. It's not about you. It's not about you leading it. It's about coaching them to do it and them multiplying it naturally. So Bertolo and Jerry go back and start engaging in this process in a group of people that in 100 years of missionary activity had only seen less than 100 people come to faith. And in the last 20 years, they've planted 632 churches and seen 18,539 people come to faith. Praise God. They began sharing this idea with many other African leaders. And one of the African leaders, go ahead and go to the next slide, in East Africa, he started praying, Lord, where would you have us engage? What is the crisis that you want us to engage in? Actually, I feel like I skipped something. Oh, yeah, let's pause here. Let's go back to within every crisis is a kingdom opportunity. I want to talk about that before I go on to my next story. So there's a couple of things as we started engaging in these different communities that we started learning. Some counterintuitive principles. And like I said, one of them is within every crisis is a kingdom opportunity. Right? So these crises could be the war in West Africa. For me, I'm absolutely convinced now that the wars that were happening in West Africa created the tinder that when the spark of the gospel came, they became on fire for Jesus. I have friends who were missionaries in Syria for years before the war happened, and they saw very few people come to faith. When the wars started happening, churches around Syria and in Syria were overwhelmed by how many Muslims were coming to church. But it's not just wars. You see these same things in refugees or in any kind of human crisis that you look at around the world, human trafficking or, for me, I lived a mile from Columbine when that happened. Right? Try telling students they can't pray in school after something like that happens. For weeks, Every morning, thousands of students were gathering around the flagpole to pray. They were hungry for God to intervene in the midst of their crisis. I'm convinced that part of the reason why we haven't experienced the growth of the church, the American church over the last 30, 40 years is because we've been living in relative safety, security, affluence, apathy, comfort, right? And my hope is that we can start looking at this differently, because some people are looking at what's coming and they're going, I'm really afraid. I'm going, hold on. Let's go to the next one. The gospel spreads most during tumultuous times. It just does. The light shines brightest in the darkness. The church is called a light on a hill. Well, when do you best see a light on the hill? When it's dark, right? This would be the one thing that I would ask you to write down for today. I learned this idea in a perspectives course, and it changed my view of world news. And now every time somebody comes on the news and says, oh my goodness, this awful thing is happening, I'm going, oh, and I bet God's doing something amazing on it. I bet he's at work in it. I don't have time to tell you the stories of the different regions where this is true, but I'm telling you, in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, what sparked what is now a huge movement of Muslims coming to faith was the tsunami that wiped out Banda Aceh. And some members on our team were the first people landing on the ground, ministering to people. And their world being wiped out created opportunity. The gospel spreads most during tumultuous times. Don't be afraid of tumultuous times. Here's the next one. Suffering and victory are hardwired together. Amen. That's a counterintuitive kingdom principle that's hard for many people to understand. Oftentimes we hear this idea that the safest place to be is in the center of God's will. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. We don't have to look far let's just look at our King. His suffering on the cross led to his death, burial, and resurrection, the greatest victory of all time. Amen. Then why, when we start going through hard times, we go, God, what are you doing? This must not be your will. I mean, we think if we start going in a direction, we start hitting like something difficult, we assume that he must not want us to do that then. It's like, well, that's not how he operates. And yet, if I go to the gym, everybody will tell me, no pain, no gain. They know that you physically have to tear apart your muscles to let them rebuild stronger. And yet when my life gets torn apart, I go, God, why? God, why? If you read John 11, there's one phrase that is said twice. First by Mary, and then by Martha. And I can almost hear their tears. Jesus, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. You put your own words around that. Jesus, if you had been there, my son but I'm convinced he works through difficult things. No irredeemable harm can come to you. That doesn't mean that hard things don't happen. Suffering and pain is a reality of life, but God can redeem any of those things. And like the song said, he's the only one who can. He sees and sees a highway. He's the only one who does. He sees bones and sees an army. He's incredible. Lord, help us to see suffering differently. All right, let's go back to that picture of the guys in prison. We had a team in East Africa. They were praying through, okay, what crisis, Lord, do you want us to lean into? We believe that every crisis has an opportunity. What do you want us to do? And they started praying, and they decided, we're going to go to the prisons. So they went to the prisons, and they started looking for persons of peace and starting Discovery Bible studies. This Discovery Bible study started with a man named Ahmed. Once again, not his real name. Ahmed is an Islamic sheikh. And as I continue this story, you're going to hear me talk about Islamic sheikhs, Islamic clerics, or imams. When I use those terms, just think of like the priests, Sadducees, and Pharisees of Jesus' day. Right? They're the religious leaders in that part of the world. Now, he's a sheikh, and he starts going through the Discovery Bible Study. Now, in a Discovery Bible Study, let's show the 4 questions that are included in every Discovery Bible Study. You read a passage. Like I said, usually we're working from creation to Christ, but once we've gone through that, we might study other aspects of Jesus' life and ministry. But each time you read a passage, you ask, what does it say? What does it mean? What will you do? Who can you tell? Or who will you tell? We try to keep it simple so that it can be repeated by anybody. And anybody can open the Bible, read it, and ask these 4 questions. I'm not going to spend much time on the first 2 because I think most people do that. I think the second 2 are what make Discovery Bible Study more unique. What will you do? In every Discovery Bible Study, everybody commits to do something this week. Right? Okay, I feel like I need to ask my neighbor for forgiveness. Okay, it's got to be concrete. So next week when we get back together, before we read the next passage, we're going to ask each other, did you do that? I think in America we call that accountability. Many of them would call it obedience. It's a little different. The 4th one is what creates the multiplication and the reproducibility that you'll hear us talking about. The question is, who will you tell? And every week, everybody commits to tell somebody about what they just learned about. So when Ahmed was asked, he said, well, I'm going to tell my cousin. He's a more influential sheikh. So he starts the Discovery Bible Study with his cousin. And when he asks his cousin, who are you going to tell? He's like, well, I know some local imams who need to know this stuff. So he starts Discovery Bible Studies with them. When I was having breakfast with Ahmed, he's telling me that when they got to 6 Muslim clerics, imams, and sheikhs who'd come to faith, they decided, you know what? We should just focus on telling the Islamic leaders of our community. And then he ended his breakfast by saying, Jason, there are now 33 of us who are all whispering to each other, we think we found the way. That was years ago that I had the opportunity to meet him. I called him 6 months later and I said, hey, I'm trying to put together this little brochure that describes our ministry. Can you walk me through all the different names of who's been influenced by this? And this next picture is what we came up with. And the dynamic we seek is a chain reaction of disciples making disciples that result in a cascade of churches planting churches. As Ahmed began to share with others, for the last several years, we've been hearing that they're seeing, on average, a Muslim cleric, sheikh, or imam come to faith every week. Last week, our regional director was in California preaching a sermon, and somebody called me afterwards, and they said, he just said this year they've seen 92 alone. Guys, that's tectonic plates in the spiritual realm that are shifting. I brought a book with me. Jerry Trousdale wrote it. It's called Miraculous Movements, How Hundreds of Thousands of Muslims Are Coming to Faith in Jesus. We have a research and reporting team that cross-checks all the pastors' numbers of who's coming to faith and double-checks what they're saying. And in our last quarterly report, we just passed 600,000 Muslims that have come to faith in the last 16 years. Now, that's across the world. That's in Indonesia. That's in places like India. That's in across Africa. But guys, that's huge. But they're not talking about that on the news. They're just telling you the bad news of what's going on in the world. They're just telling you about, oh no, these bad things are happening. But I'm telling you, God is on the move, and He's doing incredible things. And I think we have some principles that we can learn from our brothers and sisters as they engage in this. But you better believe, if you start seeing that many leaders coming to faith, imagine if 92 bishops of the Mormon Church in Oregon came to faith in Jesus, in the truth of His kingdom, what kind of backlash you'd be dealing with. Yeah. So what comes next is pictures of persecution. I think the hardest part of my job is taking phone calls and hearing about persecution. I can tell you about them burning down churches and burning Bibles. It gets a little more difficult when I start hearing about our friends who've been hacked in the head with a machete or their hands cut off. But there are some things I can't say up front that I get phone calls about. that they do, and it's awful. And sometimes they kill church planters. There's one particular part of Africa where we had just gone through a season of persecution. They burned down 12 churches, killed a church planter, and beat up a bunch of other guys. And shortly after that, a flood happened. Let's go ahead and pull up the picture of the flood. And our regional director calls our president because he knows that every crisis has a kingdom opportunity. He says, I want to go help this community. Can I have some money? He said, I don't have any money. We've been using all our money to help people during COVID and try to pass out food to people who can't work anymore. And he's like, okay, but I will cut you a check for $10,000, trusting that God will provide, but go talk to Jason, and maybe he can help you get the word out. So I talked to the regional director, asking him his plan. He lays out this whole big plan of how he wants to help all these families and provide resources and home health care and some food and all these things. And when we outlined it all out, it was going to cost $133,000. I was like, oh, man. So we put together a little video. We posted it on Facebook, and not many people saw it. But one believer did. And he called and said, I'd like to give $100,000. And somebody else came and gave it a little bit more, and God raised up all the money that was needed. We sent it to the regional director. He went to the leaders of this community, and he said, I want to help you. They said, do you know who we are? He said, yeah, I know who you are. He said, we're the ones who burned down your churches and killed your church planter and beat up those other guys. He's like, yeah, I know. Why are you here? Our Muslim friends in the other mosques aren't helping us. The government's not helping us. Why are you here? So we believe Jesus has called us to be here, and he taught us to love our enemies. And it created an opportunity for them to start showing love to their enemies. This was last fall. And in the last several months, we have seen over 100 people who've been baptized in that community. I believe that more will come. You know, the first story is a 20-year story. That's a year in. But it still shows some things that we're learning along the way. So how do we learn from our brothers who are facing these challenges? I've got 3 ideas that I'd like to share with you. The first one is you gain irresistible influence when you move towards a crisis. That looks different in every region. Like I said, in Indonesia, it might be working with prostitutes or gangsters. In Sierra Leone, it might be working in these Muslim communities. In Côte d'Ivoire, it's street kids. In East Africa, it's famine, floods. But when you move towards it, you create incredible opportunities. But I would say this can also be true for us here. Right? When you move towards people in crisis, you start showing love to them, it creates different kinds of opportunities. What's the next one? How you behave in adversity says the most about what you believe and who you are. I heard this just a few weeks ago from one of our sisters in East Africa. She owns a large manufacturing business. Her husband's actually our African director of research and reporting, but she is his sugar mama, and she runs a business. She's a great Psalms 31 woman, runs a big business, but her Muslim cousins decided they wanted her business. Started passing around lies, taking her to court, and she got sent to prison. And oftentimes in places like this in the world, when you get sent to prison, it's like a death sentence because they don't feed you. Family and friends have to feed you. But she had family and friends that started coming to her, but she knows that there was lots of other people in the prison who weren't getting fed. And they would harass her, tease her. They heard lies from these other Muslims, and so they were harassing her. And she got out, and the very next day, she started a ministry to go back to the prisons and feed people. And then she said this just like a few weeks ago. I was like, oh, I got to say that when I'm with Nicole. How you behave in adversity says the most about you and what you believe. What's the next one? Your mess can become the message. Yeah. Do you know who's the best person to go into a brothel and share Christ with those who are being trafficked? Someone who's been trafficked. Do you know who's the best to share their faith with a Muslim? Someone who's been a Muslim. I can keep going, but I think you understand where I'm going. You know who's the best to minister with refugees? People who have been refugees. So what's the message going on in your life? For me, it's struggling with a son with mental health issues. It wreaks havoc in our life. But what I find is when I get together with those who are also struggling, I can encourage them in their journey. And they're like, oh, you get it. You understand. Like, you're not just talking like hypotheticals. I'm sorry, but much of what my Christian brothers and sisters were saying to me in my early part of my journey with my son was not helpful. I found it trite and not helpful. But when you give it to God and He redeems your mess, your mess can become the message. But I don't think we should assume that it's going to be easy. You know, when Jesus in John 11, first he decides to stay, but then he starts to go, and they said, but Rabbi, a short while ago, Jews were trying to stone you. Like basically somebody said, hey, maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe you shouldn't go down to the prison. Maybe you shouldn't go down to, minister to people, who have mental health issues. Other people mock him. Some people laugh at him. I think as we find opportunities to love on others, I think we should be prepared that there is going to be some, even believers, who would caution you or even give you a hard time, but I think we need to lean into these opportunities. What's the next slide you've got? Here's my final thoughts. Perception and paradigm. Why am I telling you all of this? Well, the first one is I want to challenge your paradigm. When you see bad things are coming, when you see things are becoming difficult and darkness is beginning to reign, I don't want you to be afraid. That's when the light shines the brightest. Right? God is on the move even in the ugly stuff. Every crisis has kingdom opportunity. The gospel spreads most in tumultuous time. God works through suffering to bring victory. Like I said, the light shines brightest in the darkness. And when the darkness comes, I want you to remember three things. First, Jesus said the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all nations, and then the end will come. That's a certainty. That will happen. Second, he said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And third, in Habakkuk, we know that the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will cover the earth like the waters cover the sea. That is coming. Right? That's coming. Keep those things in mind. He's going to build his church. These other things won't stand against it. So when you see bad things happening, don't assume God has forsaken you. But what I read in the beginning, in John 11, he said, now Jesus loved them, so when he heard that he was sick, he stayed there and waited for 2 days. He may be waiting. There are times that he waits. The second thing the reason why I'm telling you these things is just for inspiration and action. Some of you are ready to go. You're in a place in your life where you want to engage in what God is doing around the world, and I would say go for it. Go find some kind of crisis to engage in. Remember that you gain irresistible influence when you lean into a crisis. Go to the prisons, go to the hospitals, go to the nursing homes. Well, here's another idea. Go to a mental hospital on visitation night. And go into the lobby and just look at all the parents who are waiting to get a moment with their kid, who's either suicidal, who's addicted to drugs, who's struggling with violence or homicidal ideation, and just see the hopelessness in their eyes. And find a creative way to love on people. I mean, honestly, you don't have to go very far to find people in crisis. I mean, get to know your neighbors. Many of them are in crisis. Talk to your coworkers. Get past the, the water cooler conversation, you'll find people are in crisis. And I would say find creative ways to love them. Keep your eyes open for those who are persons of peace, people who are spiritually interested. God's already working in their heart. Have those spiritual conversations. Invite them to Discovery Bible Studies and point them to Jesus. But I would also say that there are some of us who are not in that place where we're ready to be inspired into action. We're hurting. And we're struggling. Maybe we're in that place where Martha and Mary are at, where we're wondering, Jesus, if you'd only been here. So I would say keep in mind, as I've been sharing these stories today, that all of these stories have the benefit of hindsight. We already see how the suffering was redeemed for God's glory. We don't see the waiting period. Right? So don't compare the highlight reel to the junk in your closet. Right? People stand up and they share their best stories. We haven't seen the best of your story yet. We know that God redeems suffering. We just may not have seen how he's going to redeem yours yet. So my encouragement to you would be to look at that verse. Jesus loved them, but he chose to wait. He allowed things to hit rock bottom before he intervened. And then remember people like me, or people that you know and hear, whose lives hit rock bottom, and it was in that moment that they finally cried out to God, Jesus, save me. And that's when he redeemed their story. So I keep having to remind myself in my son's journey that there may come a time where he hits rock bottom. In the meantime, I want to keep praying that today is the day of salvation and be praying every day in faith and to never give up hope that today can't be the day. But trusting my Father, like the father of the prodigal sons who just sits and wait. He didn't run down to the son who's eating in the pig trough and be like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? He sat and waited. So I'd encourage you to wait if you're in that place with family or friends that are struggling. But I think there's a fourth category of us. And we don't resonate with the redeemed side of the story. Maybe we resonate more with the people who are starving, or the people who are flooded, or in prison. Yeah, we may not be starving physically, but maybe starving spiritually or emotionally. May not be in prison physically, but in prison of your own trauma, the struggles that you've gone through. Maybe to the point that it feels like somebody's taken the butt of a gun and bashed you in the face. And I want you to know that there's a Father who loves you more than a Bertolo Johnson who would adopt a little kid. You have a Father in heaven who will adopt you into his family and help you find healing and restoration and help you find a new life. And I'd like to end with what we were talking about earlier, about how he can turn graves into gardens. He can turn bones into armies. He can turn seas into highways. In fact, he's the only one who can. And to be honest, every time I sing that song, I come to tears. And I think of all of what my son's been through and all that I know that is going on in his head. Bertolo is convinced that some of it's spiritual warfare. And maybe it is. But he's got so many chains in his head. And I just cry out to God, you're the only one who can. You're the only one who can redeem that story. But I know he can. So let's keep singing that song and let's keep praying for those moments in our own lives or in the lives of each other. Let me just pray before I step down. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you that you're not afraid when the Taliban takes control in Afghanistan. You're not afraid when our country seems to be going awry. And in fact, you see bones and you see armies. You see seas and you see highways. And you see opportunities in a crisis when No one else does. So Lord, help us to see things the way that you see things. Help us to find creative ways to love those who are in crisis and to help point them towards you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Actually, if we could just invite the worship team up. And we just really want to finish by declaring that song. I just so appreciate what Jason shared, because I think for maybe not the first time, but for many of us, it's been a while where we look around and we can feel really hopeless. But I appreciate this shift that no, actually, God's on the move, and there's incredible opportunities all around us when we step into his story. So can I just invite you to stand? We're just going to finish with that song, and then you're going to go eat some ice cream.
I searched the world, it couldn't fill me, no. Man's empty praise, treasures that fade, never enough. You came along, put me back together. Now every desire now satisfied here in your life. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing is better than you. Nothing bigger. There is nothing.
if you want to connect with Jason, he's out in the courtyard by the ice cream table, and he has more information around New Generation. So thank you. Bless you guys. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. Thank you. Thank you, team.